from Electrocraft.
Welcome to Room Tone. My name is William Garrett. The room tone for today's conversation comes from Electrocraft East, my studio in New York City. The room tone is altered by the voice of musician, educator, and author Warren Zanes. Growing up in rural New Hampshire, at 17, Warren joined the Fuegos, a band started by his brother Dan. This took him on a classic rock and roll journey, but one that he ultimately found unfulfilling. When a girlfriend suggested he try college, he not only tried it, but he earned 2 master's degrees and a PhD. This experience led to teaching at the university level and a position as vice president at Cleveland's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Today he continues his role as educator as the executive director of Little Stephen Van Zandt's Rock and Roll Forever Foundation. As an author, he has many books to his credit. He produced and consulted on the Oscar-winning documentary 20 Feet from Stardom, and his most recent project is the book Petty, the Biography, an unvarnished look at the life of rocker Tom Petty, which Rolling Stone calls one of the best rock biographies in recent memory. And his music is still going strong as well. Warren has just completed his 4th solo album. In this conversation, we talk about a young man trying to fit in and the longing that led him to music. From bicycle grease to PhD in 12 years, the need for music education to be woven into the fabric of general study, and that through his personal experience in the study of others, the creative life can lead to many disappointments, but perseverance wins the day. Thank you, Warren, for stopping by. I know you're crazy busy, as you were just telling me, with all the things you're out there doing, so thanks for making time for me.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a long time since I've seen you.
A long time.
You haven't changed a bit. Going back to the beginning, I know you come from a super creative family, so tell me about growing up in New Hampshire, the family, and what kind of creative influences did you have early on?
It's funny, I just got in trouble with one of my siblings, let's just say it's not my brother, for the first paragraph in my Tom Petty biography, because I start with a little description of the family and where I was at when I first heard Tom Petty. And so I was talking to the sibling in question who was upset, and I had made reference to avoiding her in the hallways at school, because she was wearing homemade dresses and she was reading fairy tales from around the world. My mother was shopping at the Salvation Army, and I just wanted her to find alligator shirts, the Izod shirts, so that I could just fit in. So there was a creative family back there, and I think in our adult lives we've celebrated that. But the truth was, at the time, what I was feeling most keenly was not fitting in. We were living in Concord, New Hampshire, and before we moved out to the country, we were renting a floor of a Victorian brick house, and we all slept in a glassed-in porch, 2 beds on either side of the room. We had a swing in the living room, a turtle pond, and it was, in a lot of levels, fantastic.
Right.
We had the stereo right next to a picnic table in the dining room, and during dinner we were, blasting Sticky Fingers. So it sounds great, but then you go out into the world, and, when you're young, approaching adolescence, so much of it is about just navigating that passage safely. And fitting in is often the thing,
of course, yeah,
that you equate with a kind of safety. So I learned a lot about art. I learned a lot about a creative way of making the domestic space interesting, even if you didn't have a lot of money. I learned to love reading. I learned to love music. But I always felt a little bit a part of, because, across the street, the dentist's kids had their own bedrooms,
right,
and they had the alligator shirts. So to your question, I look back and I go, thank God for that. And at the same time, I don't mind that my own children are a little bit more toward the center. We were often on the strange periphery. But it was also, we had an attitude, I think, and it was never formulated. I just think it was underneath the surface. There was an attitude of, we have less, but we have more.
So sort of a pride in that situation.
There's a pride in it, but it's almost defensive. So I don't think it was particularly healthy. That's a very long answer, but I think it's important to set it up. We came out of the box with a little bit of desperation, and you can get some things done if you're desperate enough.
Now, were your parents both making art when you were young?
My father wasn't in the picture at all. I mean, I just went and saw him for the second time in 35 years. I took my two sons to meet him that never met him. I grew up with, a handful of visits, but didn't really know him. He had a PhD in English from UT Austin, and he talked about writing the great novel. I don't know how that ended up. But my mother is a photographer, and she was active, but she was also a single mom raising 3 kids. So it wasn't like she was sitting around and figuring out how to be the next Edward Steichen. She was figuring out how to get the next meal under the table just as much.
Now, were there any other creative influences outside of the family, school or teachers or anything like that put you on a certain path?
Early on, no. I mean, when I think of myself at a young age, I quite honestly, I think of a fairly bright-eyed but pretty vacuous kid. I feel like I was only like halfway tethered to the earth. Like when I see my own kids, I think, are they floating off into space in the same way that I was? I think it took me some years to come into the world. But for creative influences, we had a cousin who played in a bar band, Trigger Cook. I remember going to see him in a club in Concord, New Hampshire, and he dedicated the Eagles' "Best of My Love" to me, and it was the first night that I had a what is the kids, a Shirley Temple? Yeah, it was my first Shirley Temple, and it was the first time going out to see live music like that, and I thought really like this was the combination of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan with the Beatles at Shea Stadium. It was big. It was very big.
So as you're floating around as a young man, what did you finally smash into that got you on a path toward making music?
Sexual intercourse. It's when I collided with that, I knew it was time to see if I could get into a band. I always had a lot of longing. My longing for a girl was as strong in first grade as it was in 12th grade. I know that's not the case across the board. I don't think it's actually advantageous, but I just remember that, like really strong feelings. And when that was fit together with the physical part of it, I think that's when I started to recognize something like ambitions. I want to do something, have something in order to keep getting my needs met.
I can relate to that longing from an early age as well, and it's interesting to draw that into to making music and being in a position to continue that admiration.
Though admiration is too soft a word. In talking to Tom Petty for the biography, he described early childhood experiences of wanting to connect and, deep longing. He grew up in an abusive home, and I personally think there's a connection between the two. All is not well at home, and so you go looking elsewhere for some deeper level of human connection. And so he was falling in love to the degree that he was putting his own well-being at jeopardy, because when it's not answered, you're in rough shape, and to be that young, to be, experience physical abuse at home and, unrequited love out there on the streets. That's a heavy load for a young person. And I think in his case, he found something in songwriting that was a safe place beyond all of that. And he could take his pain. He could also take his unrequited love there. That's interesting stuff to me, and I identify with it.
Now, how did you translate this longing into first starting to play music? So was the Del Fuegos your first musical experience, or had you done something before that?
I'd done something that's like not even worth a mention. My brother came to me, I was 17, and he asked me if I wanted to join the band. I wanted nothing more. And I said yes to joining the band, and then asked him what instrument I would play. And he said guitar. So I had 3 months to learn to play guitar.
So you weren't playing guitar at that point? Were you playing anything?
I played some drums, but not, to the beat of my own drummer.
Exactly. Of course.
So it was a punk rock ethos. He had an idea. He went to see the Blasters, Dave and Phil Alvin, and he saw them and said, there's something about that, fraternal chemistry that makes sense in rock and roll. It's fiery, throws off some sparks, and he got that, when he had me join the band. I just only regret that we didn't have a longer formation period, because I think there was more untapped in that band than ever got, brought out into the creative part of the process. And I'm not I'm talking a lot about this book. It's so at front of mind. But what studying Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, you're studying a real band. They found themselves. Members came, members went. They learned to do what they did on stages, in studios. They made the mistakes that you got to make on your own. And one thing that happened with the Del Fuegos, I joined that band. We signed a record deal within about 6 months, and then we got a producer, Mitchell Froome, who knew far more than we did about how not to make mistakes. So he made records for us that were beyond us. We couldn't have done them without him. He kept us from making the mistakes that as a band we needed to make.
I see, that you needed to learn for yourself.
Absolutely, and I don't fault him for that. What producer worth anything would not use all their powers to make the best possible record?
To save you from those mistakes.
Yeah, that's the job description.
Exactly.
But for bands to become and to sustain that thing, they need to make the mistakes. And it's almost like it happened for me too quickly. The band was together, I joined, record deal, producer. It was too fast.
So maybe too much too soon.
Yeah, too much too soon. But we were of course desperate young men.
Everybody
no,
is.
more.
Exactly.
We weren't going to slow it down.
Yeah.
So again, I don't fault Mitchell Froome, because we wouldn't have kept him from doing everything for us that he could.
Post Del Fuegos, you decided to make a very strong return to school. So tell me about that switch, and what was the motivation to head back to school and go so deep in terms of master's degrees, PhD, et cetera?
Yeah, understand this. The way you just described it makes it sound like I had a plan. I'd left the band, and I went to New Orleans in pursuit of a girl, and I got a job as a bicycle mechanic. So from my last big tour was opening up for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and I could not wait for that tour to end.
Really?
Could not wait. I was really, really unhappy.
You would think that would be the boy's wildest dream accomplished.
Which it was, but I was so unfulfilled by that time. So there we were, playing Madison Square Garden. Within a year, I was going to be in New Orleans, a bicycle mechanic with, grease on my hands.
Wow.
The next release by Tom Petty, which is how I set my clock, I remember hearing it on the radio, and my hands were just covered in this black grease because I could not fix this derailleur on a Schwinn, And my boss is looking at me, and it's like, haven't you fixed the derailleur before? I was like, yeah, I've fixed many, And then this song comes on, and it sounded so good. And I'm looking at my hands, and I'm like, wow. Part of me was like, look how far I've fallen. But another part of me, like, I've always been a big Tom Petty fan, and I felt the lift of hearing him move to his next phase. He's always going to that next place in a brilliant way, I think. But yes, part of it was, look how far I've fallen. And the relationship I was in, the young woman eventually looked at me and said, all you have to talk about is music. You have one dimension, and you should think about going back to college. And I said, I can't go back to college. I've never been in the first place.
I was just going to say, had you gone to college before? And I didn't think you had, no.
So my car had been crushed by a tree in New Orleans because they have wicked storms. So I had no car. So I took out a map and I found the closest university, which was Loyola University. And I walked to the admissions office and said, I'd like to take a couple summer classes. I'm trying to stay in a relationship. Can I bypass the application process? And they said yes.
So now, wait a minute. I got to get this straight. You said, I need to go to college to keep my relationship going, so can you guys just let me in?
Yes. And that's what happened. So I got my PhD, but I never applied to college, to undergrad. After those 2 classes, the girl dumped me, and I fell in love with school. I loved it. And 12 years later, I had a PhD. So I went bachelor's, 2 masters, PhD. But as I was doing that, I'd always been writing songs and just putting them on a shelf. When you're sitting down and you're writing your master's thesis, your PhD, there's nothing like having an acoustic guitar to just go someplace else altogether. So the songwriting stayed where it was. The difference was that I just never did anything with it. And then I was starting to see my ex-wife, and she gave some of my songs to the Dust Brothers, who had done Beck's Odelay and Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique. And I got signed to a record deal as I was finishing up my PhD. So I took a leave of absence, made a record, and it was in this one window. And I met Joe Pernice of the Pernice Brothers, and our managers put us together. And we went on this, blind date. And he said, boy, you should write a book in this series that I'm writing a book in, which was the 33 1/3 series.
Right, I love that series.
I knew nothing about it because it didn't exist yet. So Joe and I are in the first series. But, that's now what I look toward on a first date is, is there a book deal in it for me?
That's hilarious.
Joe set the bar very high.
So this was the first book you wrote?
Yeah. I mean, and these are short books, so they're almost more like long essays. But each book is on a different album. I selected Dusty in Memphis. And
Dusty Springfield, of course.
Yeah. Legendary record. Not a big selling record, but one that after its initial lack of success just became a kind of the equivalent of like a cult classic in film. But it was this window of time where I was neither fish nor fowl. I hadn't yet finished my dissertation, but I was teaching. I had this record that I made, and I had this book, and I didn't quite fit anywhere. This kind of hybridity is interesting to me. There is no money in it. But that changed when there was an article in the New York Times about me and my brother, and the people at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in Cleveland saw it, and they were looking for a vice president of education and programs. And so I was sleeping on somebody's floor playing a show in Boston. I got a headhunter call. It was a big shift to go from being what I was to being an executive at a museum. There were a few jobs out there that didn't make me look like I'd made a series of mistakes. It made me look like I was on a career path.
Right, exactly.
And so the right job made it all appear to make sense.
Now, how was that experience?
It was a great experience. I think the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is misunderstood because of the induction process. If you haven't been to the museum and all you know is the inductions, you're going to have a particular understanding. And it's a distorted understanding if you know the museum. Really, the museum is imagine a Smithsonian for rock and roll. That's really what it is. It's trying in the museum medium to tell the story of this American culture that, as we all know, has been profoundly influential worldwide.
Of course.
And we don't study rock and roll in school a whole lot. There were no museums dedicated to it prior to that. I look at the museum as the music getting its due, and I just would try to avoid the topic of the inductions.
Were you tasked with some sort of musical education projects?
Yeah, I ran the K-12 programs, but I was also a visiting professor at Case Western, which is it's a top 50 research university that's based in Cleveland. So I got to teach a class each semester or each year out there, and I worked a lot with artists, and I got to do a lot of thinking about the music, and I learned a tremendous amount out there.
Because you were interviewing a lot of artists that were involved in the museum, right?
Oh, my first live interviews with Mary Wilson from the Supremes, and it went on and on. It was Dr. John, Robbie Robertson, Honey Boy Edwards, Mick Jones from The Clash, Grandmaster Flash, kind of you name it. And it was like master class after master class for me. I was doing an interview with Johnny Rivers. Johnny Rivers is an interesting cat, but he's not like front of mind. People don't talk about him like they talk about Jerry Lee Lewis. But it was one of my favorite interviews because the whole of the interview focused on everything that happened before Johnny broke through. So he was 15 and Alan Freed signed him to a deal, and he went into the studio with Otis Blackwell. 15. Nothing comes of it. Goes back home. Hank Williams' widow finds him. Gets him signed to MGM. Nothing comes of it. He writes a song. Ricky Nelson covers it, puts it on a record. Big deal. It's the Ricky Nelson song that doesn't do well. There's a series of things. And then he made that live at the Whiskey, and a Chuck Berry live cover is what he breaks out with.
Wow.
So what makes Johnny Rivers differently? He kept dusting himself off and moving forward. Like, if you want to get into a creative life, you better have a taste for disappointment. Yeah.
Believe me, I know.
With that interview, I started rethinking interviews because I realized anyone who I'm talking to who has a career, there's a pre-career.
Exactly. There's a backstory that's almost can be more interesting than the story we all know.
That's where you learn how they became who they became.
Right.
Like this, the part of their personal history that's visible to us, that's what they became. So what were the raw materials? What were the disappointments? How did they manage to, in the face of those disappointments, carry on? And the best ones can stand a belly full of disappointment, and they just have an idea like, this is going to happen. Most people just walk back home licking their wounds. The satisfaction from the art has got to be 1% stronger than the disappointment in not succeeding at that art. Just 1% more. It's got to have that much more strength, and then you can go forward. Most people, the balance is different. There's more of an investment in succeeding, and so when there's disappointment, they're in trouble. They're in that kind of space of vulnerability, and that's when they go, maybe business school makes a kind of sense.
Exactly. During these interviews, you met Stephen Van Zandt, which took you to another role in music education.
Yeah. I did a live interview with him in New York City, and I did something close to what I did with Johnny Rivers, where it was not about the E Street Band, it was not about the Sopranos, it was not about Underground Garage. It was his whole musical trajectory up to about Born to Run. So we connected on this approach, and he's easy to connect with because he loves the music, and he's an ambassador. And so he talked to me about a foundation that he was starting, and he said, hey, if you ever leave the Hall of Fame, call me. I was actually transitioning back to the East Coast, and in the midst of that, 6 months later, he called me again and said, I'd like to talk to you. And I had a contract from the Hall of Fame on my desk, and I hadn't signed it. And he made the right offer, and the heart of what he was up to spoke to me because, when you think about music in school, it's in music programs. And the ambition in music programs is generally to get instruments into kids' hands and get them playing. And Stephen was looking at it differently. He was going like, hopefully that's the end result, is that they pick up instruments. But there should be also like studying music in a way that makes young people more historically aware, but also makes them better listeners. When they approach the world of literature, they're learning to become better readers. And then as better readers, they go into this wider world of literature, and some become writers. Why don't we think about music like that? Because you look around, whose world isn't informed on a deep level by their listening practices? But a lot of times they haven't, built their critical listening skills. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do with books. What if we had classes that did that for music, that gave the context to the music, that helped, young people to see that, when Elvis Presley made That's All Right in 1954, that it's the same year as Brown versus Board of Education. And there's something going on in terms of race politics that actually connects these two unlike events. Why did that song mean what it did when it did? Well, there's a context to it that helps us to understand that. It's never arbitrary when a song becomes a hit. So this kind of thinking informed Stephen's approach, and that was something I was certainly interested in, and we were of one mind. The way music is lived, it's lived as a visual culture. It's lived as a fashion culture. It's lived as a political culture. There's so much more beyond the sonic experience of that song. That's how we need to study it. It's funny. I was at a fundraising dinner that was hosted by Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, and there were more Republicans around the table than I'm accustomed to. And what I liked about it was you saw that rock and roll is not party affiliated. But there was one guy who was not a rock and roll guy, and he was saying, hey, I'm all for Chuck Berry and The Who, which I actually did not believe, but he said he was. He said, but school should be about reading and writing. And when I was a kid, we memorized poems. And I just had to stop him and say, your greatest ally is pop music, if that's your interest, because kids are still memorizing poems. They call them songs, and they have an internal grammar and a poetics, and they learn about rhymes and the power of the couplet. Make no mistake, the poetry's there. The question is whether we are going to bring that poetry into the classroom. This makes sense in the English language arts. This makes sense in social studies. This makes sense in media studies. This is general music. But the other advantage you have is if you're studying music across the curriculum, which is the way we advocate studying it, and there are budget cuts that hit the arts first, and that's the way it goes down, and that music department goes away, the music doesn't go away because it's in the other disciplines. So there's a kind of practicality, and there's also a defense of the arts position.
Now, how do you go about getting it into those subjects, without rewriting all the history books?
Well, I just made the example of, Brown versus Board of Education. Well, that's something that's being studied anyway. rise of the suburbs in post-war America. Hey, that's being studied anyway. We link it to a Beach Boys lesson that talks about California in particular. The rise of the automobile. No mistake that some of the first rock and roll songs are about cars. What is that car culture? Where did it emerge? Car culture gets studied. Civil rights gets studied. Reagan's America gets studied. For us, it's taking things that are going to be in the classroom anyway and saying, here's the connection to music. And this isn't just to get you thinking about music. The music's going to help you understand that other subject area better. Dropout crisis is a real thing. And what is at the heart of the dropout problem? Well, there's certainly, economics, racial issues, but also student engagement. If you can engage that student, they might stick around. So what is it that connects a student to the classroom? Well, oftentimes it's something that they're already connected to. So if they're disengaged in the classroom and they walk out and they put the earbuds in, they're going into a world where they feel empowered, where they feel like they have some authority. If you can connect that world to what goes on in the classroom, you bring their engagement with it. It is not easy. Change in education is hard.
So the big news is your new book about Tom Petty. So tell me a little something about how that came to pass.
Well, when I wrote the Dusty in Memphis book, it's not a book that sold a lot of copies, but it did so much for me personally. And Jerry Wexler, who was one of the major figures in Atlantic Records and who made Dusty in Memphis, is somebody that I interviewed for that book, and I talked to him quite a bit. And I was worried that he wouldn't like what I did with it. And one of the happiest moments I remember is when he left a message, and my then wife called me and said, "You got a message from Jerry Wexler," and he said, "Finally, someone got it right."
Wow!
And it was such it still moves me just to think about it. But then he went and bought 150 copies of that book and sent them out to various people.
Which is almost a higher compliment that he wanted to spread the word.
It was fantastic. It's good to have, solid distribution. It's way better to have Jerry Wexler.
Exactly.
But after that, I got a call from Diana Ross. Just left a message on my machine at work. Didn't go through management, straight from Ms. Ross. And she picked the book up in a London airport and said, "Would you come to New York so we can talk about writing?" And then I got an email from Tom Petty's management saying, "Tom read your book and would like to sit down and have dinner next time you're in Los Angeles." We had a dinner, and I hadn't seen him since, shortly after the tour that we'd been on. And it was fun just having dinner because I've always admired Tom Petty. He's always been the guy who meant the most to me in music. So dinner was cool, and then at the end of it he said, "So, I read your book, and I actually read it twice, and after I read it the second time, I wrote a song that was inspired by it." And now that was just almost a notch more than I could handle.
I was going to say that's pretty mind blowing.
It was. I was out of the music business at that point.
Right.
I'd gotten the bike mechanics grease off my hands, but I was just a teacher. To have him say that was pretty wild. And then he said, "I'd like you to come back to the house and hear the song." So I went back to his house with him, and we listened to this song, "Down South," off the Highway Companion record. And my book, Dusty in Memphis, dealt with the American South as a kind of object of fantasy. And this song, played with ideas and mythologies of the South. And this started another chapter in our relationship. And, I then, was on camera for an interview for Peter Bogdanovich's Running Down a Dream movie. Then I did a companion book for the movie. And I ended up writing light notes for the live anthology. And along the way, the idea of a biography came up. he came to me and he said, would you be interested in that? And I said, I would definitely be interested. And he said, well, it would be your book, not mine, not co-written, not ghostwritten, not authorized. It's your book. I'll help you, however you need to be helped. You got my cooperation.
Because he's a very private man, and it was amazing that he was willing to open up like this.
Now, I could say it's funny. There are a number of reviews that are coming out to talk about us being friends. We have a professional friendship, and certainly many times it's felt like more than that. But it's always on a job. We don't go fishing together. I think he set it up in exactly the right way. So in addition to all that he said, it's not authorized. He asked, his request was to be able to read it at completion and respond to anything he felt the need to respond to. Couldn't tell me what was in, couldn't tell me what was out, but he was allowed, to respond. Now he came up with that whole conception on his own in about 2 minutes. And what it did was it took the control away from him, and it meant, he said himself, because I asked, why not authorized? He said, when I see a book and it says authorized on the top, I know it's bullshit.
Interesting.
And
just because the person has molded their own story the way they want it repeated in the world?
Yeah. He's like, this needs to be honest, because it's not who he is to have something whitewashed. It's just never been the Tom Petty character. The biggest piece was that conception of here's how you get to something that is more honest. Tom Petty, give myself to the author. The author has control. And I guess, obviously there has to be some level of trust.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to say that's a very trusting move.
It's a very trusting move. It allows for a very high level of vulnerability. It was, for a guy so private, surprising at times. He said something to me, about halfway through the process. He said, there's just no reason to do anything but tell the truth. We don't need our rock stars to be saints for them to be heroes. Actually, they might be a little more heroic if they're in a human frame. Then we have a point of engagement that allows for more identification, but also you see what these people come through to make their art. You go back and listen differently.
It's an amazing way to open up the experience of your relationships. Since we all have relationships with these people, because we've grown up with them, we've listened to them through good times and bad and all that sort of thing. This is a great way to experience that relationship even deeper.
Here's this guy who, when I got my first real girlfriend, I was listening to Tom Petty. Before I got my first real girlfriend, I was thinking about her listening to Tom Petty. When I got married, I was listening to Tom Petty. When I got divorced, I was listening to Tom Petty. When I had kids, I was listening. You don't have too many artists that, you can turn to throughout almost your whole life. And I've had that with him. So to do the book was a remarkable experience. And I don't think I'm going to find another situation quite like this one.
Well, you led right into my next question. What's next for you?
I'll tell you what's next when I'm sure it's next. We're guarded with these things until we feel like
we can talk about
they're real. In this world of disappointments and living through them, you just don't share too early.
Exactly. The path that we've discussed, your path, is to me so fascinating that it's gone from Madison Square Garden to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and now as a celebrated author of this great book. So I'll be very interested in seeing what happens next as the path continues to wiggle. Well,
thank you. And being true to the kid who grew up in the music business, you know, I do have a new record that I'm going to.
You know,
I'm going to play you a few tracks.
Yeah, I was going to say, we did skip over that a little bit. So you do have a new record, because you've made records all through this process.
Well, this one is my 4th solo record. So, yeah, I keep doing it. I keep doing it because for a number of reasons, you know, the songs come, so you take care of them. I'll tell you where it started, though, is because my last CD was my divorce recording.
Your divorce record, yeah.
And this one is I survived it and I got a girlfriend. I wrote 26 songs for her on my iPhone over the course of a month and a half. And that's what it is.
Well, I'll look forward to hearing that.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's a bit of a triumphant time for you, so that's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Thank you.
All right, Warren, thanks a lot for coming in. I know you've been really busy, and congratulations on the book. I think it's truly an amazing achievement.
Thank you.
And we'll talk again soon.
All right, man.
Okay, thanks. For more info on Warren Zanes, go to warren-zanes.com. For more on the Petty Biography, go to tompettybook.com. This track is What You Do from Warren's new album, The Biggest Bankrupt City in the World, coming soon on Dual Tone Records. Check us out at roomtoneradio.com and find us at iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Remember, an interesting conversation sure beats talking to yourself.
I love the way